I must have been off duty after being on a night watch. And this little group came up our path from the road below. And I seemed to see somebody rather familiar, and I looked more closely. And it was Winston Churchill, who was then the Prime Minister, accompanied by several senior-looking naval officers. If you met a senior naval officer, you were supposed to salute, but Wrens were only allowed to salute with their hats on, and having been on night watch all night, certainly wasn't wearing a hat. So I did the only possible thing and waved and said, "Hello everybody, good morning." And they all said, "Good morning," and including Winston Churchill. They went on to the edge of the cliff, which was now where our listening station was, and stood there and looked across at the French coast. I was very thrilled to see the Prime Minister, just slightly puzzled that what was he doing at 8 o'clock in our rather remote bit of the Kent coast. I was born in 1923 and the war started in 1939. I was very worried, and so was my younger sister, that the war would finish before we could help to win it. The service that I joined became known quite early on as Freddie's Fairies. Freddie Marshall, who was quite a young naval officer, managed to get Admiralty to pay for listening stations down the Yorkshire coast and the Channel coast. They were called Y stations because Y stood for Naval Intelligence. They each had a staff of about 12 German-speaking girls, all in the Women's Royal Naval Service. Bletchley Park was Station X, of course. So we sent our messages by teleprinter. If you typed it out on our teleprinter and sent it down the line, it would then come up on a Bletchley Park teleprinter. So we could tell them immediately, which is what they wanted. In order to pick up the signals, you would tune up and down the frequencies that the German ships used. If you were very lucky, you might get a carrier wave, because when they turned on a transmitter, the Germans always gave it a bit of time to warm up, so you would get a buzz. You wrote down as accurately as you could every word you heard. If you couldn't hear clearly, you left blanks. Quite a lot of what we heard was in code, the Enigma code. They used Christian names. The code started Anton, Bertha, Caesar, Dora, Emil, Fritz, Gustav, Hans, and so on. German names through the alphabet. If you did get a signal up, you would call the officer. She would alert the other stations along the coast. And of course, if two stations could listen to the same signal, they would get a point from which the signal was coming. that would give you the position. We picked up a signal from one motor torpedo boat saying to another, "I hear that Bobby Fimmon's crew are all going on leave next week." And the other one said, "Oh, sie machen alle Kinder, was?" They're all going to make babies. Well, it might seem trivial, but on the other hand, it meant that that particular motor torpedo boat wasn't going to be on the attack next week. My parents shared a house with our grandfather in the Lancashire countryside, and he couldn't get English cooks and maids, and he discovered that there were refugees coming to England from Austria and Germany who had Jewish blood and had to get out for their own safety. And they were desperate for jobs. One of them, Lily Getzel, did the cooking, and the other one, Edith Krochmelnik, did the housework. So all the time I was a teenager growing up, I spent my evenings with Mrs. Getzel, so I very quickly learnt German. The most operational station was at Abbott's Cliff, which was midway between Dover and Folkestone. From Abbott's Cliff, you were looking straight across at Cap Greenay. And you looked out of the window and you realized how very close at that point we were to where the Germans had occupied Europe. We could see the headlights and searchlights sometimes, and of course German aircraft coming over on raids passed over our corner. We were actually guarded at Abbott's Cliff by a regiment of soldiers, and some of us thought, well, if the Germans did land, we'd rather like to be able to defend ourselves. So we asked if they would give us some training, and they said yes, they would. So we used to go across the road, and they would teach us how to fire at targets, and some of us got rather good at this. And not terribly long ago, I was asked to just demonstrate shooting at something. I found I could still hit a target quite well, and I think my friends were a little surprised that any old lady in Chiswick could actually use a service pistol to hit a target. It wasn't all work. We had rather good social life because the local army units gave parties. Because I could drive, I always seemed to be the one who was having to drive home a bunch of people who didn't want to leave the party but had to be got in by 11 o'clock. The car was pretty well blacked out, and I was tearing along these Kent lanes trying to get us in before they shut the gate. You got to know people very well because you were working shifts day and night with two of you on, normally. Pam was one of my friends. In those days she was Pam Hardy and I was Pat Owtram.
Oh, hello.
Well, what a day.
How nice to see you.
Oh, how nice to see you. And we've always kept in touch.
It's a strange thing to call us Freddie's fairies.
It was rather strange, but then fairies can disappear, you know, without anyone being able to find them and operate secretly. And that's what we were doing. And I suppose it's quite a nice sort of term anyway,
Yes.
Freddie's fairies.
And we were good fairies, weren't we? I think nowadays people can't really understand how we kept our secrets. They're amazed that nobody knew about this, but nobody did.
I think people in those days were rather good at not asking questions.
When I came on leave, nobody asked me what I was doing.
No.
You know, it was nice to see me. How much leave have you got? But they never said, what are you doing?
Vor der Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor,
stand eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor. Da something,
auf Wiedersehen,
mit der Lily Marlene, mit der Lily Marlene. I can't manage any more words.
We didn't do that last bit right.
No, and I can't sing. I'm the only one in my family who can't sing.
So what could Winston Churchill possibly been doing on the cliffs in the spring of 1944? It was part of Operation Fortitude, covering the landings on D-Day. We were actually getting ready to invade in Normandy, and they were trying to draw attention away from the west end of the channel, more to the east end, and to plant the idea that the landing was going to be there. They thought it would be reported, and it was reported back to German intelligence. And of course, long afterwards, it dawned on me that it was a sort of decoy operation. So it actually was more significant than I realized at the time. We woke early on D-Day because one of the Wrens came rushing round saying, it started. And for days and days we'd watched convoys go past down the coast and then turn west, and we knew that they were taking troops and tanks and all sorts of things down to the west of England. We didn't really hear much in the way of messages. In fact, I remember a rather long, worrying sort of blank period before we did start getting information. But then it began to be clear that we were doing rather well in Normandy, so that was a great relief. When there was no sort of coastal traffic to listen to anymore, we closed Abbott's Cliff down, and we were still in the Wrens, so I was sent off to Admiralty in London to translate captured naval documents. We were looking out for possible German officers and people who needed to be tried by the war crimes tribunals. So although it was rather nice to be in London at the end of the war, it wasn't nearly as interesting as listening for German ships. I didn't feel like a spy because we had uniforms, so anybody would have known we were in the services, and they would just have assumed we were in the normal Wrens service. You were not really allowed to tell anybody. I could only say if people asked that I worked in a radio station. And we were very careful to keep it secret. It must have been pretty important because these German ships were attacking our convoys or laying mines off the east coast and so on, and we really needed to know about that.
Well, I'm sorry that you've come here on a day like this.
I don't know if I've ever seen it look quite so grey.
You did tend to make friends for life, and you did feel you were really doing something that mattered.
I think we were very lucky that German was the language we knew.
Yes.
And that's what they needed.
I did other jobs afterwards, but I think probably that Wren's interception job was the most useful thing I ever did do. You're never told you've been terribly useful, but the head of our section, Lieutenant Commander Freddie Marshall, I do remember he wrote after the war, "Like all good fairies, you will live forever," he wrote. And that was a rather nice recognition.